Hello, my name is James Roberts, and I have the privilege of serving at Church at the Crossing in Indianapolis, Indiana. And it is quite an honor to be able to speak to those of you who are doing everything you can to reach people for Christ, to honor Christ, and to become like Christ. And so it is an honor today. And today I'm going to be talking about how do we shift our church from maybe a more comfortable spot to becoming a mission-led church in our own community. And so let us pray as we prepare our hearts after we all got back from what I'm sure was a wonderful lunch. God, we call on you today. We thank you, Lord. And God, it was good to hang out with our friends, to reconnect with people, to ask questions, to have discussions. But now we turn our attention back to you, and we ask you to speak to us today, to challenge us today. In Jesus' name, amen. Pastors, associates, professors, and students, let me begin by asking a question today. Imagine if your church shut down tomorrow. Here's the question. Would your city or your town really even notice? Now, I'm sure that there would be some members who would be very sad, but would your community actually feel the loss of your church shutting down? Would people ask, where do we go for help now? Who's going to help us now? Because if your answer is no, we have to ask ourselves, are we really living out our calling as a church? Are we being the church of God that God called us to be? This question changed my life when I asked myself this question, or I believe that God was asking me this question a few years ago. And I believe that this question can change everything for you as well. You know, I've been at the Church at the Crossing now for over 7 years. I've been in full-time ministry for over 25 years. But the last 7 years, my post has been at the Church of the Crossing, and let me tell you, I love the Church of the Crossing. I love the people there. I think they're some of the most wonderful followers of Christ I've ever met. I think some of them are going to be my friends until, I leave this earth. I also have wonderful leadership, very smart, godly people who seek God's wisdom. They're also bold leaders. So, first of all, to say I'm very blessed indeed to be at Church of the Crossing. But when I started there, the church was 116 years old. Can any of you relate? Rich in history, but like many churches, when I got there, Church of the Crossing was at a crossroads. Now, the previous 7 years before I got there, they had seen about 700 members leave the church. So they were discouraged when I got there. Many were heartbroken for their church. There was an air of depression. And one person said to me when I first got there, he says, "Pastor, when are we going to be a big church again? I miss our church being big." Another person said to me within my first couple of weeks, "You know what, if there's just one more mess up, one more thing goes wrong, I'm out of here." All right. So I walked into a church and there was some baggage. Clearly, there was some baggage. Still a very strong church, but some serious wounds. And during my first year there, I knew I just needed to get to know the people and love the people. And so that first year, I met with about 400 different adults. And I had almost every one of my breakfasts, lunches, and dinners scheduled, and a lot of private meetings in my office. So I just wanted to meet and love on those people. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner almost every day with a church member. I also gained about 40 pounds, but it was all for the glory of God. Now, I also told the staff when I first got there, okay, this church has had enough loss. We're not going to take any ministry away. We're not going to take anything away from them, at least the first 2 years. We're only going to add ministries because they experienced so much loss and they had so much anxiety when I got there. We just needed to have church for a couple years. I don't know if you know that. Sometimes when you go into a new church, you just need to have church. You don't have to make a ton of changes. Sometimes you just need to sing to Jesus and talk about Jesus and then go love each other like Jesus. And so things were going well. We saw some growth. We even added a Thursday night service, which is probably my favorite service that we have each week. And I felt like, all right, we're on our way. And then the pandemic hit. And it disrupted literally everything. Every hidden crack in our church was exposed during that time. You see, we're at the very tip of a large city, Indianapolis. And our church is at the very tip of northern Indianapolis. And we are right in between the city and the suburbs. Now, if you know anything about Indianapolis, the city and the suburbs politically, very diverse. Okay? And really, when I first got there, that didn't matter much day to day. But when the pandemic became political, people were isolated. It was an election year. People were anxious. They're either mad or they're sad about our country. And all of a sudden, people start dividing up politically in our church. I had a lot of people leave the church because I wasn't right-wing enough. Had a lot of people leave the church because I wasn't left-wing enough. And some people just wanted to leave. Had a lot of staffers resign during that intense time. Our congregation went through another sifting. I was being sifted. And there was this moment, and it was probably the lowest moment of my ministry life, where I actually had this thought. Okay, did I move my family from Pittsburgh to Indianapolis to be the interim pastor here? I really didn't think I was going to make it. And I'll be honest, I was exhausted. I was in grief. And another thing, throughout the first year of that pandemic, I experienced loss 48 out of 52 weeks. Either one of my family members died. I had 12 close family members die within the first year or so of the pandemic. Or church members died, or church families left. So 48 out of 52 weeks, either somebody in my family died, a church member that I love died, or a church family left. That's a lot of loss. That's a lot of loss. And also during that time, my daughter was in clinical depression. And my wife and I were on suicide watch for about 2.5 years. Thankfully now she's thriving. God is doing a great work in her life. But man, that was a nightmare to live through. Pastoring a church in the pandemic, suffering loss. And then, man, you guys know, and gals, you know that when the home's not right, you're not right. So, okay, so I was in counseling. I was on the verge of burnout. And I know a lot of you pastors, you've been there. And I know that a lot of you pastors had it worse than I did. Our church didn't split. God met our financial needs. New people found our church during the pandemic. And I got to hire literally, I think, the most amazing staff members. But it was still a very challenging and dark time. And it was in this dark moment that God began to speak with me about what type of church He was calling me to lead, what type of church He wanted us to be, what He wanted to do through us. So here I am. I'm on this side of burnout and thinking, I don't think I'm going to last in ministry. And I already started talking to close friends about what is my next career possibility. I even talked to the personnel committee and said, you know what? If it would help the church hire another pastor. In the midst of that is when God showed me what He wanted us to be. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? He showed me the future when I thought there wasn't a future. And so my focus shifted from trying to build a church to leading a group of passionate followers who love Christ to impact a city for Jesus. So the vision literally changed the mission. And so I felt like I first got called to this church, and I think a lot of you who've taken over larger established churches or just any established church, you think that your mission is just to restore the church maybe. But now the vision had changed to the church restoring those who were broken in our community for Jesus. So on a weekend, God had been speaking to me. And so on a weekend, I was full of nerves and I was on the edge, and I shared what I believe God has shown me to the church. And I showed them Matthew 25. And if you don't mind, I would love to read that with you today. It says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels are with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. You all can probably quote the rest of this. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came and visited me. And then the righteous will answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you, a stranger, and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And then the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. I shared with our church, I said, I know that we have one life to live. It does matter what we do with this life. It matters what we do with it individually. In other words, do we know Jesus? But it also matters what we do together as a church. We got one life as a church together. What are we going to do to live out Matthew 25? And again, I believe that Matthew 25 explicitly teaches us that, yes, we are saved by grace, and salvation is based on our relationship with Jesus Christ. I do believe there's also a heaven and hell. Okay? But I also believe that in the midst of Matthew 25, I think that Jesus has let us know that it really does matter what we do with our relationship with Christ. That matters as well. And so I said, here's what we got to do. We've got to figure out what Matthew 25 means for our church. Okay? It's not going to be exactly this scripture. I said, and I was just very honest with him. I said, you know what? I don't think any one of you can feed a big community. I don't want any of you going around trying to find naked people. Okay? That's not what we're, and some of us, we don't have access to a prison. Okay? What Jesus is saying here is he says, look around you. Who's hurting? Who's broken? And what are you going to do about it? And let me tell you something. I shared with the church. And in the midst of God speaking to me, God gave me one of those moments in my life I will never forget. And I told the church that I had recently found out that the people from our community in North Indianapolis drove past our church. And there was another church and ministry about 50 streets up. We have a grid system. It's incredible. So 50 streets up. They were going there to get their food, all the help that they needed. When families were in crisis in our community, in our region, in our little square block area, guess where they were going? They were literally driving past our church to go to another church who had to pick up slack because we weren't doing what we were supposed to be doing in our community. And when I heard that, I told the church, never again. We will never, ever, ever again be the type of church that people will drive past to go get help. If you're in our area, in our community, and you need help, you're going to come here, and that's the church we're going to be. We're going to find out every need that we can meet in our community, and we're going to launch a ministry. And we are literally going to be the hands and feet of Christ in our community. Never again will people drive past our church to get help. And I told them, we've been here 100 years. There's no excuse for this. And then I said, here's what I see. Guys, we got some pretty grounds here. But I hope those grounds become a garden, that our church members grow vegetables so we can feed the poor. I want to see a food pantry started that has high dignity, that feeds over 1,000 people a month. I hope that we have ministries like an oil change for single moms and widows. I see a day where we have a widows ministry where we take care of all the things in their house from our church that maybe they can't afford to do something. I see us having free counseling service, free medical service, a legal clinic, free haircuts for those kids each quarter. that can't afford that, a laundry hub, expanded employment opportunities, and also see us launching a Celebrate Recovery ministry. In other words, we're going to look at all the needs in our community, and if it's a need that we can meet, we're going to launch a ministry, and we will be the hands and feet of Christ, no excuses. Church, this is where we're going. And that weekend, God challenged our church, and our church said yes. But I also know we have some work to do. Man, we got a lot of amazing people at our church, just like you have at your church. Amazing people, they know how to get things done. But if we were going to become the church God wanted us to be, then I knew that we were going to shift our focus from building a church to impacting a city. Okay, that's different. And in order to do that, we needed to also become a little bit different as a congregation. And so I started talking about how we need to become people of grit. People of grit. Now, what does it mean to lead a church with grit? Well, we started by saying this, and I say this all the time, especially that first year. I said this over and over again. And by the way, when you say this to a crowd, and a lot of those people have been there more years than you've been alive, it's challenging, but I would say this over and over again. If you're not willing to get your hands dirty, it's not a good time to be a member here at the Church at the Crossing. I love you, but if you're not going to get your hands dirty, maybe this is not the time for you to be part of our congregation, because we're changing. We're going to become a different people. And so what does it mean to be people of grit? It meant that one Sunday morning when our power went out, we just got candles and still had a worship service in the dark. A couple months ago, we were having our Monday night study groups, and the water went out. Naturally, you can't have, a couple hundred people coming in with no usage of the restroom. Well, our staff said, well, we're people of grit. We don't cancel because of stuff like that. So we ordered porta potties and forged forward. No excuses, no quitting, no creature comforts at our church. And I preached several times on what it meant to be a people of grit. And I had to tell our church, we're not going to be a country club. We're not a country club, okay? We are the hands and feet of Christ. And I also said, we need to get a little tougher around here. During the pandemic, it seemed to me like when anyone was offended or bothered by anything, they would just leave and go to another church. In Indianapolis, that happened like crazy. And I said, you know what? That is not a disciple. And you know what? If you got a problem, if something rubs you wrong and you hop to another church, guess what you're saying? You're saying, I don't want to be discipled. I don't want to grow. I just want to avoid. And so I told the people, you know what? You're going to get offended here. You need to get a little tougher, because that's how you're going to grow. And so we started doing things. We started doing things differently. For instance, we turned our 1,500 square foot choir space into a food market. Hundreds of families being fed every single month. This past Saturday, we fed, I think they told me over 300 or 400 people. Our pantry walls were bare, and so we had to go up on Sunday morning and say, all right, grab bags, bring the groceries in next week. We need to refill our pantry. We transformed our gathering places, which was a really nice, swanky room that hosted parties, and the church spent about $100,000 transforming it into a Spanish ministry room, even before we had a Spanish pastor. And now we have a Spanish ministry that is packing that room out, changing lives. I mean, massive life change. We stopped funding missions. They didn't preach Jesus. And by the way, this cost us a little bit. Cost us some favor with some people. One group that we were giving $10,000 a year to just were absolutely shocked when we pulled our funding away, because they told us that they didn't know if Jesus was the only way to God. So they were shocked that we didn't give them $10,000. But we start making decisions. If this is something if this is not something that Jesus would do, or if it's not preaching Jesus, we're not in. We're out. We launched homeless ministry, a pregnancy support ministry. We launched a legal clinic for immigrants, because Jesus didn't tell us to stay in our buildings, but he told us to go. We finalized a merger with the Arabic church, launched a Spanish ministry, and now every week we see about 5 different nations on the stage. And here's the impact. Just over the last few months, in the last 6 months, we've seen 119 people make a commitment for Jesus Christ in our services. Muslims are even being converted. We have millionaires worshiping next to people who are not just living paycheck by paycheck, but are kind of living like 2 paychecks behind. We have people who have chosen life over abortion, worshiping next to these mothers who are walking beside them and giving them hope. We have neurosurgeons changing diapers because that's the ministry they feel called to. You know what? And we've experienced resistance. Just a few weeks ago, I get a phone call because there's a Muslim out in our parking lot bowing down and praying against our church. Yeah. When you go out there and you shake things up, you're going to get resistance. So here's what we got to do, pastors. We have to learn how to lead with grit. And let's be honest, it's not easy. Okay? Because we live in a culture that idolizes comfort. And let's talk real for a second. A lot of us, we want to become all things to all people. When we do that, we're going to stand for nothing. And if we let the loudest voices in our church dictate our mission, guess what happens? We have mission drift. And if we try to do what is going on right now in big ways, to appease the culture, here's what happens when we try to appease the culture. You lose the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. No. So what you got to do, you got to stop playing it safe. You got to stop asking, how do we grow? And start asking, how do we serve? Okay? And not only do we need to be a people of grit that get their hands dirty in order for our church to move forward, but here's one thing we realized. After the pains of the pandemic, where I'm leaving because you're not right-wing enough, I'm leaving because you're not left-wing enough, and I'm leaving because of this, and I'm leaving because of this, what I realized was that our church has no future if we're not unified in our theology, in our mission, and in our values. So here's what we did. We posted our core beliefs online so that no one was confused in our church about our theology. We are very conservative in our theology. I want to remind those in the Church of God, we are a holiness movement church. We reorganized our ministry, so every single thing that we did was centered around Jesus and his mission. And let me tell you something. I was really concerned that we were going to have another exodus as we declared, here's where we stand on this sexual issue or on this big cultural issue. Instead, our church found unity. Young families flooded in, and here's what they said. Oh, it's so good to find a church that actually stands for something. And then you guys actually go do something. And here's the thing, now we're different. We look different at our church. We feel different. Every week we have 5 services, 3 in English, 1 in Arabic, 1 in Spanish. And also next month we're launching Celebrate Recovery. So we're going to have a 6th service. We are a different church. We even look different. And 2 things I hear from almost every single family. They say, 1, they love the diversity of our church. Anybody who knows Church of the Crossing history would never have said in the past that we were diverse. We're very diverse now. And secondly, they love that we preach conservative doctrines, but we still do things like launching immigrant ministries. We have a couple people in our church right now becoming paralegals so that we can launch our immigrant connection ministry to help immigrants become naturalized. And the person who coordinates that in our area said that they've been trying for years to get a church to take this ministry on, but no one wanted to take on this hot political potato. Well, it's sad that we can't preach the gospel, but also go out there and do gospel works because we're afraid of what politics will say. So, sadly, conservative theology and works like helping immigrants, sadly, those often, they don't go together. And one thing that we mention almost every single week in services, we say this: our goal is not to become a bigger church, but a better church. We want to make better disciples. In other words, Jesus called us to become like Jesus and then do the ministry of Jesus. So we don't make decisions on numeric growth. We make decisions based on, is this something that Jesus wants us to do? Let me tell you how this has played out recently. We had a decision to make about joining Immigrant Connection, which was a huge deal several months ago. Everybody's all worried about the immigration stuff. And in this big meeting, where we're deciding if we're going to take on this political hot potato, which helps people become naturalized, one of our lawyers, John Zirkle from our church, he said, you know what, guys? Talking about the political climate. He said, if we don't do this, are we really the church that we say we are? Wow. All right, we're going to do it because it's right. Embrace Grace is a ministry where we walk beside girls who decided to keep their babies instead of have an abortion. In the last couple months, we've walked 2 young ladies through 11 weeks of Bible study. Then the ladies of the church got together and threw them a baby shower and flooded them with gifts. Those girls haven't missed church in several months now. We started a homeless ministry in our area. And one of the homeless guys, we found out it was his birthday. And so guess what they did the next week? They brought him a birthday cake into the homeless camp. When do you think the last time anybody cared about him enough to give him a cake and sing happy birthday? That's being the hands and feet of Christ. And again, we're seeing a lot of people come to Christ. And here's 3 things I do every single week as a pastor. Every single week, these are just my kind of 3 things. I take a new family out for lunch every single week so I get to know them. Number 2, I send flowers to whoever's grieving or has surgery or going through a tough time in their life. I have a list of prayer requests that I do that. And the 3rd thing is I gather the staff together every Monday, and we spend about a half hour to 45 minutes walking through our sanctuary, praying for each other and praying over our whole church. And often we're looking at prayer requests. And here's what I noticed last week. And I even reached out to a couple of our pastors and I said, every one of these lists I've read for years, almost every prayer request is about an illness or job concern. But this week, here's what we got. Matthew, a young man, says, my prayer request is I want to regain my faith. Colin says, I'm looking to find Christ again. Cassie says, I want to grow closer to Christ in my faith. Let me tell you something. That is change. That is change. God is sending. See, when you go out there to the world, God will send you people from the world. Let me just show you a picture. Last week, we're going to throw up a picture here in a second. And the picture is of our newcomer party. When you look at that room, let me tell you what I found out. As I walked around this room, I found out that one couple came to our church because they were first a part of the legal clinic. And they were so blessed by how they were loved on. They said, man, we want to go to this church. Another family in their mid-40s with 3 kids, no church background. Just started showing up to church a few months ago. Now they're serving. And also, she just got baptized a few weeks ago, the mother. Another table was ladies from Embrace Grace Ministry who decided to keep their babies. And there they are just with their family being loved on. Another table was ladies who marriages had fallen apart and they just needed to start over. As you go into the community, let me tell you something, your church will look different. As you go out to the broken, as you go out to those who are hurting, your church is going to look different. But here's the cool thing. In the midst of your church looking different, your church is going to become different. Let me tell you, slowly but surely, we're starting to become known for our mission in our area. And let me tell you, that's big. Because in Indianapolis, most churches are known for the worship style and the vibe they give off. And here's the thing. We want to play the role where you come to our church because you're drawn to the mission or you've been ministered to first. Not because we're the cool church. I tell the church all the time, on purpose, we're not being cool. You know how easy it is to not be cool? It's so easy. Okay? Just be yourself. There. That's a lot easier. You can do that. We can do that. But let me tell you as I close up today, what we want to do is I want to encourage you to lead like Jesus. Jesus was a man of grit. Jesus went after the one. Jesus did whatever it took to get something done. So final challenge to pastors. Pastors, let me challenge you with this. If your church were to shut down tomorrow, would your city even notice it? Would it matter? Would the government officials be asking, well, who's going to step in and help people now? If the answer is no, then here's what you are called to do. It's time to make some changes. Stop playing it safe. Stop worrying about keeping everybody comfortable in the church. It's time to stop letting culture dictate our gospel as well, because our job is not to build comfortable churches, it's to build disciples. And disciples, they're made in the hard places, the broken places, the places where faith requires action. Now, I know a lot of you students, you're eventually going to take on a church that is older and established. And there's this temptation when you come into these churches to make it more appealing to younger people by modernizing the looks, the music, the brand of the church. I want to remind you, your job and your calling is not to modernize the church. Your calling is to help a church become like Jesus. So here's what I would call you to do. Just figure out what Jesus would do in your community and start doing it. It's that simple. Preach Jesus and do what Jesus did. It's going to take a while, but eventually your church is going to become more like Jesus. So here's my final challenge. Let's not build a bigger church. Let's build better churches. We need to lead with grit, call your people to commitment, preach the gospel with clarity. And when the world looks for Jesus at work, guess where they're going to find them? They're going to find them at your church because you refused to play it safe. My brothers and sisters, go lead with grit. May God bless you. Here's what we're going to do now. You've been given some questions, and they're designed to create conversations that might even be uncomfortable. I would encourage you now to take this time seriously, get together in your groups, and have that conversation. May God bless you.